Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Clipping, Visions of Bodies Being Burned. Before we get into the actual review here today, you're probably wondering, or you might be wondering why this review is coming out as late as it is, given that this album has been out for like 2 months at this point. If you want to know the full reason why I posted a recent update video to the channel, I highly recommend you check that out. But the short version of the story is that I've just had a very busy couple of months and I haven't been able to put out as much content as I would have liked. So yeah, we're reviewing this now because I really want to talk about this record. The album that Clipping put out last year, Their Existent Addiction to Blood, was my favorite record of last year. Overall, just a fantastic experimental hip-hop project, one that you certainly need to check out if you haven't done so already. And considering that Visions of Bodies Being Burned is not only coming out, a year after that album came out, but is also, a sequel album of sorts, or maybe a sister album is a more appropriate thing to call it, considering both albums were, put together in a sense at the same time, only this album was kept another year to be released. Apparently there were some changes and ideas worked into the record after the release of Their Existence and Addiction to Blood, so it's not like this whole album was just sitting around for a whole year before coming out. But yeah, basically these two albums were made around the same time. They're meant to have similar ideas to them. They're meant to be companion pieces to another. And for that reason, of course, if I liked Their Existence and Addiction to Blood, I was probably going to like this record too, and I'm very happy to say that after giving this thing now, 2 months of listening, I still think this is a fantastic release and a fantastic follow-up to Their Existence and Addiction to Blood. With splitting up the songs into these two records, Clipping didn't do it based on the quality of the material. It's not like they put out the best material on the first record and then followed it up with, maybe some of the weaker songs and stuff like that, like, some artists tend to do. Rather, they split it up just based on which songs they think sounded good in comparison to some of the other tracks. So really you're getting, another great batch of songs here on this project. The quality of the material here is really, for the most part, just as amazing as it was on Their Existence and Addiction to Blood. I mean, it's not quite as, shocking to me now in terms of just how amazing the quality is, given that I have had a year sit with Their Existence and Addiction to Blood already, but the quality of the material here is just still amazing, and the sound of this record is fantastic too. If you heard Their Existence and Addiction to Blood, you probably know what you're going to get coming into this record, because on paper, it's really not all that different from that first record, which I guess makes sense. They're meant to be sister albums to each other, but there are some subtle differences between the two that I will be discussing in a little bit, because I think some of those differences really give each of these records their own distinct, flavors, if you will, in comparison to each other, and they make them their own distinct products, even if, they are still tied together conceptually. When it comes to the instrumentals here on this project, you're getting Clipping's typical brand of very noisy, harsh hip-hop. You still have a lot of Daveed Diggs' really fast, engaging flows, and the lyrics here on this project still deal with themes like black empowerment, racism, police brutality, things of that sort. But like on Their Existence and Addiction to Blood, the band is taking these topics and then twisting them through this horror-themed lens, where every track on this record is like its own short story, this horror-themed short story, if you will, that has a more relevant social message to it at the same time, very much like the tracks on Their Existence and Addiction to Blood did. And much like that record, there isn't an overarching story here on this project, and there's no overarching story or anything running across both records when put together or anything like that. Really, each individual track here is more so its own story that's just kind of unified together under having similar themes and the same horror-like approach to the presentation of them, whether it be through things like folklore or horror movies or things like that. You have this somewhat unsettling edge to all of the lyrics in the songs here. And when it comes to the storytelling itself here on this record, it's overall just really fantastic. Much like on Their Existence and Addiction to Blood, the attention to detail in the storytelling here is just phenomenal. The way Diggs is able to go into so much detail about the stuff that he's talking about. He's really able to paint pictures for you just with his words. You listen to these tracks and just taking in what he's saying, and of course the instrumentals that's providing as a backdrop to everything, you're able to really see in your mind exactly what the story is trying to be. Every time I go to listen to these songs, I have this little movie playing in my head about what each track is supposed to be like, just because he's able to go into so much detail here that it just comes effortlessly to me. Well, I think that's enough of talking about the similarities between the two projects now. I think it's about time to talk about some of the differences between both projects because on paper and maybe on your first few listens of this thing, this project is probably going to sound a lot like more of what you got on their Existing Addiction to Blood. But the more I gave this thing a chance to really sit with me, the more some of its distinctions really shown to me. Probably one of the biggest being that the sound of this record is one that's overall a bit harsher than that of their Existing Addiction to Blood. It's not super noticeable, but I think this record uses a lot of harsh noise a lot more frequently than that album did. One thing I talked about when reviewing that project was how much I liked how the group was able to mix kind of out there experimental industrial noise with some more conventional elements at points, whether it be having some catchy hooks mixed into that record, or even like a track like Nothing Is Safe, for example, which had some trap influences in its instrumental. It's a project that I felt like struck a really nice middle ground between those sounds while still, being very clearly an industrial experimental hip-hop project. Here on this project, though, you still get all that industrial experimental stuff, but a lot less of the accessible side of things, too. There's a lot less hooks on this thing that I think are really catchy. There's a lot less moments in the production here that's accessible, a lot more harsh noises mixed into this too. And for the record, I don't think any of this is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think it gives this record a very distinct personality when compared to its sister record, and I think it makes this record feel a lot less easy to get into. It feels a lot harsher and harder to really just digest, if you will. It just feels so much more abrasive. I think the best way to really put this is that on their Existing Addiction to Blood, there's a track, Lamella Ordina, which uses a harsh noise outro to it as like this kind of odd standout moment on the track that nothing else on the record really has. And while that's the case on that record, on this project, you really couldn't get away with something like that because there's so much more moments where the record will just throw harsh noise at you and just be really difficult to digest in that regard. It's a record that feels like it has its guard up a lot more than their Existing Addiction to Blood did, but in a way that's really interesting. This record really just can't get away with throwing some harsh noise at you every once in a while and have it be this super jarring moment or anything just because it's so commonplace here on the record. If this record wants to give you something a bit heavier and a bit more jarring, instead it decides to go the route of a track like Looking Like Meat, for example, which is probably one of the most aggressive moments, not only, on this duology of projects, but also just in Clipping's catalog in general, with some very visceral performances on this thing, courtesy of the featured artist. It's just a really aggressive moment here, unlike anything else on either of these two records, and it stands out as a highlight on this record because of it. I think another moment where these two records really stand apart from each other, and I think maybe one of the more telling places where they stand apart from each other is the closing tracks to both records, because both records close out on some instrumental cuts, but they're very different kinds of cuts. On their Existing Addiction to Blood, it closes out with piano burning, this like 17-minute long track, which is just, the audio of a piano burning. It's this very ominous track, which initially when I heard it, I felt like it was supposed to be like this cool down of sorts after everything else on the record. And to some extent, I still think that's true, but after listening to this record, my opinion on that has changed a little bit. I think that that track being as subdued as it is meant to reflect maybe the tone of that record as a whole, in contrast with this one here, which I feel like is a bit more noisy, a bit harsher at times, a bit harder to get into. And I think the closer on this record reflects that as well. While the closer track to this record is a lot shorter, a lot punchier, a bit more to the point, if you will, I still think it's maybe the more out there of the two instrumental compositions, because while Piano Burning is the longer of the two, it's, kind of easy to get wrapped up in the atmosphere of that track really easily, and it's kind of a similar idea being repeated throughout that really lengthy period of time, whereas on this track, there's a little bit more going on, it's a little bit noisier. Again, much like this record as a whole, it's just kind of alien and hard to get into, but in a way that's really rewarding once you actually do manage to puncture that surface and get into all that goodness on the inside. And especially when you take these two records as a whole and put them side by side, it's really interesting to see what elements they share and what elements they decided to, do differently from one another. But I still think that despite their differences, these two records make a ton of sense when put together. Thematically they make sense paired together, and just sonically as a whole too, despite some differences, they make sense together as well. Despite this record generally being less accessible than, say, There Exists an Addiction to Blood or even like Clipping's debut album, for example, there are some moments on this thing that maybe do showcase that accessibility in very small doses. I think the second to last track on this thing, and Lacing, is probably the best example. The beat on this thing is kind of cloudy, kind of dreamy, still noisy too though, and I think that this instrumental serves as a really great backdrop to Dig's really melodic hook here on this track, which is definitely one of the most catchy on the entire project. I also feel like on the lead single from this thing, Say the Name, the instrumental to this track, is probably one of the more accessible moments on the project too. It has this kind of bouncy feel to it that I really like, and I think a lot of people could probably get on board with, though, you know, certain other parts of this instrumental certainly fall a bit more in line with the noisier aspects of the rest of the record. It doesn't feel out of place on this thing or anything like that, far from it. I think it's an excellent choice for a lead single because it embodies so much of what makes this record great on it. Yeah, overall, I feel like here on this record, again, despite the fact that this thing has its own, you know, differences from the other releases in Clipping's discography, I also feel like it has a lot of what made previous releases from these guys great too, and it plays everything so well here just to make a really enjoyable listen. Really, I don't even have any major complaints with this record. Probably my biggest one would be that overall this record is probably like the least different from any of the other projects in Clipping's discography, just because it exists as like a companion piece to There Exists an Addiction to Blood. But of course, that's not really a bad thing because that's the intent behind this project. These two records are made to go together, so the fact that they have, you know, they have similar qualities and the fact that they sound similar isn't really all that much of a bad thing. And, you know, listening to this thing, it didn't really jump out to me as being as, you know, brand new as I guess There Exists an Addiction to Blood sounded to me when I first listened to that record. But I mean, I guess that's just the nature of the beast here when it comes to these two projects. If you release two similar records that are meant to go together at different times, obviously the second time around it's not going to sound as fresh as the first time, but that really just doesn't matter here with this release, because not only, like I said before, does it make sense thematically, but also the quality of the music here is just so high quality that I'm still just in love with all the songs that we got here on this new release. I don't think there's a bad song on this thing. Every track here has its own distinct personality. All the performances across this record are fantastic. The lyricism on this thing is excellent. The instrumentals are killer too. And there's just enough differences here on this project to really make it stand out in comparison to There Exists an Addiction to Blood as well. You know, it doesn't feel like a slightly lesser version of that record, which was probably my biggest fear coming into this project, because oftentimes when artists release something like this, you know, they put out a record and then a project that's meant to be similar to the previous record, the biggest problem that they have is releasing a project that's similar to that first record and having it feel lesser as a result of that. And that's just really not the case here with Visions of Bodies Being Burned. This feels like a worthy companion piece to There Exists an Addiction to Blood, and yeah, I'm just really happy that they were able to deliver on that regard. So overall, if it's not already abundantly clear, this is a fantastic release. If you like hip-hop, particularly experimental industrial hip-hop, definitely give this thing a listen, though I highly recommend you listen to There Exists an Addiction to Blood first and then this project, just because that's the order that they were released in, and like I've said at many points in this review already, they're companion pieces to each other. Though honestly, if you listen to this one first and then that one, I don't really think it's going to make that much of a difference. Like I said before, there's no overarching story across these two records, so it's not like you need to hear that one before this one. I just think that it's recommended because that's the order they came out in. But yeah, overall, definitely check out these two records. It's a great piece of art from Clipping, and I'm really excited to see what these guys do in the future, because, well, you know, between these two releases coming out last year and this year, these guys have been on fire pretty much when it comes to putting out quality material. So yeah, definitely check this out. And with that said, that concludes today's review. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this project in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. We're coming up on year-end list, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see that stuff particularly. Thank you guys again for watching this video, and stay golden!